Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on behalf of the British Chamber of Business. I'm really delighted to address the topic this morning, and what I believe we're a day 130 something in the COVID lockdown South Africa Big Brother house. And I sense we've all been feeling rather tense. We've been told we can't drink, we can't smoke, we have a curfew, yet there are still many adverts for fundraising and telling us why we should pay our rands into SARS. And as a chamber, we understand that it's painful out there. Business is suffering, there are societal problems, there's increased crime, there's increased social unrest. And that's just the good news. You know, times are really tough. And I think we've really had to look at ourselves as a chamber, firstly to say, how do we add value to our members throughout this difficult, challenging time? How do we become relevant? But also, how do we avert this webinar fatigue? Because there's so many webinars about COVID and what to do. And I think we've got to the point whereby we know on your behalf, we have to be the challenging voice of business. So with members such as BAT and Diageo, they're being told they can't train. We need to work with the British government to push hard to address that. But equally, we need some practical solutions and examples of how we can help you survive, particularly in the SME space and the smaller enterprise space. What can we do to ensure we survive during this period, but equally thrive going forward and prepare ourselves for the future, because this isn't going to be the last crisis we face. So I'm delighted to welcome a really distinguished panel this morning. And I'm going to give a detailed introduction to Ivor, Gardiner, Corporate Development Director of Berwicks, and to Timo Rylander, one of his associates. Ivor's joining us from Bath in the UK. He's a son of South Africa. Timo's joining us from Zurich. But before I do that, I'm going to hand over to Gareth Cremen. Gareth and I have spoken many times about business rescue. We spoke pre-COVID, and we anticipated a downgrade. So Gareth's a director at Lawtons. He's an attorney, very experienced in this space, and has worked on some high-profile business rescues that I'm sure we've all read about. So Gareth, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, and then I'm going to come back and give Ivor and Timo a detailed introduction, and let them speak. But Gareth, thank you for joining this morning. What is going on in the world of business rescue right now?
Thanks, John. Look, the way we've seen the market in South Africa and the business rescue, we anticipated the bubble. We've been calling the bubble to burst for the last few years. We look back in 2008, and in 2008, South Africa was sheltered by virtue of the fact that we were still getting capital injection. We had the Soccer World Cup on. We still had construction projects flowing through, which made, it enabled South Africa to survive the first wave of the storm. Unfortunately, when we look at the last 4 months, I think go back 8 months, if not 10 months, and we look at the collapse of SAA, not necessarily because of COVID, it had other underlying aspects. We saw the business rescue of SA Express, followed by the liquidation of SA Express under COVID. Primarily, the airlines have been the hardest hit. Air Mauritius was put into administration. In Virgin Australia, we've seen what happened to them. Comair recently filed for business rescue. Edcon filed for business rescue on the 28th, 29th of April underneath COVID because of inability to trade. So when we look at it, it's certainly not a full picture. Unfortunately, COVID effectively was the catalyst. It was the ultimate cause right on the top, but it was not the underlying reason. And everyone hides behind the reason it was COVID. COVID's been around a lot longer than April, as we know. It dates back to probably June of 2019, if not sooner. It was only first reported, as you know, in November 2019. But the reality is that when we look at companies in South Africa generally, they don't tend to stay and they don't tend to evolve with the times. We take the famous case of Kodak, which everyone will remember. Kodak were years ahead of its time in terms of its technology. They invented the digital camera in as far back as the mid-1980s. And they elected not to roll it out because the board was an aging board. And their attitude was that, well, people want to see photos. They want to feel films. They want to go and have them developed and, touch a piece of paper. And they decided not to roll out the digital camera. And unfortunately, through the collapse of the 1980s, you saw the revival and the rebirth of new sectors coming through. You saw the growth of Microsoft and Apple coming out of that sector. So, in light of where we are internationally, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But you'll recall back in 2013, when Nokia, who used to be the powerhouse of the cell phone industry, when it effectively sold its shares off to Microsoft in its entirety, the most moving words by Stephen Illop, the CEO, and his parting words were, "We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost." And I think that's true for most companies, and that when they find themselves internationally, and in particular South Africa as a whole. When we look at businesses and the mind shift of management, unfortunately, management are stuck in their own ways. And COVID has elevated and brought all of the flaws of the businesses to the forefront. And management seems to be stuck in the self-preservation mode at this point in time. They're not doing the forward-thinking process. They're not looking at what happens in 3 months' time or 6 months' time. They're living in the now. So they're not catering for the future. And then you find the second, so they're in survival mode. The second aspect behind this with management is that you're finding with them is that they do a lot of knee-jerk reactions. They think something is good and they do a knee-jerk without thinking through the consequences. And that's ultimately where you find a lot of these businesses are failing. They're going to business rescue or liquidation. It's just bad decisions. And if management sits there believing, well, the market will return back to normal, what is normal? You know, as we say, what's normal to a fly, to a spider is chaos to the fly. So what is the new normal that we're going to? Because COVID will still be around, the requirements to wear masks, PPE, social distancing will be around for the next couple of months, you know, and it will be a way of life moving forward. So when we look at lateral thinking, a little while ago, just before COVID, when we hit the first lot of the lockdown, when the alcohol restrictions were placed, we were consulted by a microbrewery who said, we can't afford to shut down our brewery because it's the lifeline of our business, but we can't afford to keep, you know, the quantity on site of beer. So what do? And my attitude in terms of lateral thinking was, I used the expression at the time and said, if you're standing with a glass bottle in your hand and you say, well, I can't do anything with it. In a perfect world, you use it as a rolling pin. You could make pizza, just for argument's sake. And the director looked at me and he said, well, what are you getting at? I said, well, you make alcohol effectively, you brew. I said, can you make whiskey? He said, well, I can. I've got all the stills for that. I said, well, why don't you make hand sanitizer and 70% alcohol and start selling it? It's the only thing that'll keep you going. So they turned the microbrewery into a sanitizer, into your hand soap liquid manufacturing sector, and they managed to survive it. Unfortunately, from what I've heard, is a lot of their competitors have not survived the storm, and a lot of the microbreweries have shut down and have been placed into liquidation. So ultimately, I say to companies is that in light of COVID and in light of the flaws in every person's business model, and COVID's just highlighted it, it's brought it to the forefront. We say to everyone that you should be doing an RBR, an independent business review inside of your own organizations. And in that inside of the RBR, you should be able to determine not only strengths and weaknesses, but you should be able to point out at the end of the day where your flaws are, where the future goes, how you're going to turn this business around, and so forth. And that usually brings it to the forefront. It looks at debtor management, creditor management. And the other thing we say is that directors in that need to start taking control sooner rather than later. That means reviewing credit agreements, you know, looking at the security that you have, looking at the redundancy, you know, organizational slack. You know, in the UK, and that typically, and Leon, you'll appreciate this, is that in the UK, when you talk around turnaround, usually when someone says we're doing a turnaround, it means that they replace middle management, boom, in and out. It requires a new way of thinking. And that, unfortunately, is something that needs to be done relatively in terms of the marketplace. So the question is, how do you get these things to turn around? You need to try harder, ultimately. You know, you look at Edgar's. Edgar's, unfortunately, was not a COVID scenario because of trading. It had problems dating back to February of this year when they'd written to the PRC saying, we need a bailout. SAA had been asking for a bailout traditionally for a long period in time. Unfortunately, I think due to the inactive trading season for 3, 4, 5 weeks and the limited operations, everything has been brought to the forefront. And unfortunately, this is the new norm. The next wave that you are seeing is that companies that have money are not spending the money that they should. They're sitting on top of stockpiles, whilst others are simply, you know, unable to get money in. So, you know, you're sitting really in the, you know, in the pitfalls of the A's and the B's. So, you know, as I anticipate, Leon, just as a final parting thought, you know, we sit there and we say, well, you know, it's only been a big few companies. What you don't hear about are the small enterprises, the medium enterprises in town. But from what we anticipate, given the fact that we're back to, you know, the level that we are at the moment in terms of COVID, we anticipate that this bubble effectively will have to burst properly by the time you get to November, December, because solvency, liquidity, foreseeability test is not applied by directors. So when you go into your December shutdown, which everyone presumably will take a holiday, but you can't leave the border, ultimately, you know, you've got staff pay to pay for a full month with a half month of trading. You come back in January with a half month of trading, and you've got to have enough money for cash flow for, you know, for January and February. I suspect that's when you are going to see, between the period of November and probably March next year, you know, I suspect that is when you're going to see the worst of what we have in the economy.
Thanks, Gareth. And we're going to come back to you with some specific topics and questions throughout the webinar. And again, just to encourage the audience, we've got the Q&A function on your screens. Please fire questions in. and Cecilia will raise those with the panelists as we're talking. And EMA Emission Control is going to be launching some polls so we can get your thoughts, but we're keen to engage with you. Gareth, thank you for that introduction, saying that context. Within that, there was some gloominess, but I did hear some silver linings and some practical solutions. And moving on to our next panelist, I think that's very relevant. I'd firstly like to say hi to Jamie Murray, who's CEO and founder of Berwicks. I can see he's joined us. Jamie's the founder and CEO of Berwicks, and actually Ivor, Jamie and I, 23 years ago, were at Sandhurst together. So we go back some time. And I think that's a nice way for me to introduce Ivor, who he's got a frustratingly brilliant background before he got into do what he was doing now. When we trained together, and Jamie, Ivor and I were all in the same platoon, but Ivor decided to win the Sword of Honour and be the best student for the whole of Sandhurst, which as him being a South African, as Brits, we were quite frustrated by that. Then at the Platoon Commanders Battle School, I remember, Ivor, you came top there too, before going on to serve in the Special Forces and command the Royal Irish Regiment. So a background we really respect. And Jamie made the wise move of bringing into his business a few years back. And what Berwicks do, it's a UK-based global consultancy looking at risk management, business optimization, performance enhancement, and leadership development. Now, Jamie being an ex-military pilot, Ivor being ex-Special Forces operator, I really respect their background, but I'm also intrigued to know, in the 21 years of Berwicks' history, how have you brought some of these skills, mindsets to bear in the commercial world? And that's really, Ivor, I'm going to introduce you to. Talk us through what you're seeing in the world that is the COVID context we're living in now.
Great. Thank you, Leon, for that. As you said, 21 years ago, Berwicks came into existence. This was pretty much off the back of the Piper Alpha oil rig disaster, primarily to develop crisis management and emergency response capabilities and leadership into the high hazard industries. That was the start point. We now work with a wide range of global clients, not just in the nuclear sector, but petrochemical, oil and gas, government regulators, educational, infrastructure, financial services, and even charities such as Mountain Rescue here in England and Wales. We offer a range of services. We challenge norms. We emphasize the risk management side, leadership, decision-making, which Gareth touched on there earlier, and all of this to enhance the existing potential and highlight efficiency and opportunity in the organizations that we work with. Our people are our real strength. Our consultants include, as Leon has said, former senior military, special forces, aviators, firefighters, police officers, people with extensive experience of operating and leading in high pressure, complex environments. They will all have spent probably at least 25 years in leadership positions, many with 30 to 40 years under the belt. But importantly, most of them have also, since leaving the services, spent a good 10 years or more in the business environment. So they come with a really healthy balance of wisdom and experience in multiple fields. Importantly, though, I think, is the way we do our business. We operate with the utmost honesty and integrity. And one thing I can guarantee our clients is a hands-on, BS-free service. So what do? We aim to work with our clients more efficient, improve their ability to make use of their capital, to make the capital and to make use of it. We specialize in helping to enhance their performance by building capability and unlocking their potential. We develop a very close relationship with the client. We like to embed with them, become a part of the organization, get to know the people, the culture, the organization in detail. And by doing so, identify the areas of risk, areas for improvement, and opportunities to help them develop the solutions. Critically, we never apply a generic template. So everything we do is tailored to the client and their business. We do it with you, not to you. Now, if I apply a very simple sporting equation here, where performance equals potential minus the interferences or the frictions. So if you can identify, understand, and develop your potential, whether that is your people, your planning, or your process, whilst also analyzing and reducing the interferences. Now, these can be external and internal factors. Some of them are quantifiable, some are more intuitive. Your performance will go up. And with one of our global clients, for example, within the first year of working with them, and they are a major petrochemical company, we saved them over 24 million in efficiencies in that first year. Another example, through direct Berwicks intervention in crisis management and recovery planning with a specific client, we helped to reduce a major plant turnaround over a Christmas period from a 24-day period to a 10-day period, saving them again in excess of 14 million. These are tangible efficiencies. Leadership is a critical element in all of this, in any organization's potential. Now, I would argue that nobody can thrive without good leadership. This is what binds the people, the process, and the plans together. Now, what about this crisis that we're in? And it's an enduring crisis. It's not over. It's taken the world markets from bull to bear. In the UK alone, over 25% of our businesses have shut down, and over 21% of the workforce have been furloughed. Some of those businesses will never recover, will never reopen. And just listening to the news today, job losses are creeping up. They reckon 7% unemployment by the end of the year. We don't know where the end is. We don't know what it's going to look like. And the second order impacts of this crisis is still a sea of mostly unknowns. Now, we have to adapt, we have to adjust, we have to learn to live with it. We've got to plan and prepare for further changes, and we need to evolve with it. So we've been engaged as a business with several of our clients to provide direct crisis management support. Now, I'm going to take a look at a cross-section of 3 of those clients, the impact the pandemic has had on them, where we were involved, and whether they illustrate an example of evolving, preparing, and daring. And then I'm going to hand over to Timo, who will go into a slightly more detailed example. In the interest of discretion and out of respect for our clients, I will not mention any of their names. So first off, a global electronics company. Now, early last year, a new MD took charge. He's a fellow South African, actually, and he took over the EMEA branch, Europe, Middle East, Africa. But he inherited a culture of toxic leadership, and he very quickly realized that the impact this was having on performance and output. So he contracted us to come in and do a leadership development program across every level of his organization. And when they were hit with COVID-19, they responded with agility and decisiveness, especially by comparison with their US office. What do I mean by that? What are the examples? So silos, a typical interference to organizational performance, had been torn down. Trust had been built up between the leaders at every level, who were communicating better with each other, they were information sharing better, and they felt empowered as decision makers. Please excuse my dog in the background. They made sensible decisions from the start. And I'll give you an example here. So several weeks before the lockdown started, when people were still vacillating over what this was all going to mean, they were due to go and present at an international symposium in Amsterdam. This was critical business for them. It's business winning activity. But they made the decision to cancel their attendance at that. They were looking ahead, they were planning ahead, they were extrapolating. And this was to protect their staff, protect their customers, and protect their reputation. Now, they won't come through this unscathed. They have been forced to make some job cuts, but they're surviving, and they're going from strength to strength. The MD's investment in developing his leadership team is what is making the difference there, in his own words, and it's helping them to weather the storm with tangible results. We're actually in planning with them at the moment, looking ahead to the future to look and see whether we can develop together an innovative new option for virtual crisis command and control systems. The next one is a Russell Group University, very different from those high hazard industries, but this was a real strategic shock for them. They had a crisis management plan, but their execution of this had always revolved around things like the death of a student on campus or an accident. So really conflating what is an incident with an enduring crisis, and it wasn't fit for purpose. We met with them 2 weeks prior to the lockdown commencing, and within a few days, we had embedded a team from Berwicks with them, which then stayed local up there for the next 3 months, working 7 days a week, mentoring, assisting, and drawing up an enduring crisis management plan whilst developing contingency plans for the future. Absolutely every element of their normal business was impacted by this. Now, in fairness, they had recognized this. They had seen the storm coming, and they got on the front foot by being prepared to invest and get in outside help to assist with this. So some of the interferences included the cancellation of all lectures and lessons, need for an online learning system, clearly huge cyber risks as they moved everything online, staff health risks, quite an aging faculty, a large percentage of overseas students, nearly 20% Chinese who couldn't go home, cancellation of sports, weddings, activities like this, which are real revenue-winning activities for the university. Concern for the local city because about a third of the population is made up by the student body and staff. Future revenues for things like open days, business critical activity again had to be shut down. And of course, they needed to graduate the current year group. They could have sat on their hands and waited to see what everybody else did, but they opted for being proactive. Now, they decided that this would be business as usual, but continued via online classrooms and learning. And they made sure that the communication was sound and the message got out there. And they invested heavily in planning ahead. They saw this as opportunity for evolution. And we worked with them very closely on their contingency plans to the point where they actually were ahead of the local resilience forum. And they became the prompt for that local resilience forum's activities through the questions they were asking. The university now has a fit for purpose crisis management plan. We wargamed numerous scenarios with them and conducted weekly exercises with their leadership group to test them. We maintain an enduring presence with the university now, on call to facilitate exercises, conduct planning, provide direct support if they need it, in case second and third waves of this pandemic start to overwhelm them. But they are very well configured to go forward. They're operating effectively, even whilst the crisis endures, and with all the attendant uncertainties, and they are very definitely planning ahead. And the final one I want to deal with is a nuclear energy generator. I said we've been in the nuclear industry for 21 years now. This client is the UK's single largest energy producer, and we've been doing crisis work for them for 20 years. They run annual exercises on all of their sites, partly because the regulatory requirements demand it, but also because it's good practice. And we assist with all of those. But now COVID-19 added a completely new dynamic to this, because suddenly it was not the equipment and the machinery that was the point of failure and the vulnerable factor, it was the people. So we were called in to provide direct crisis management support to their senior executive, and we're still actually doing that. They had to protect their workforce whilst maintaining necessary minimum staffing levels on all their sites to ensure nuclear safety. They had to keep on producing the power. Failure to do so would have had a catastrophic effect on the UK national grid, and they had to meet regulatory requirements. So this is managing a large and diverse workforce and all internal and external stakeholders. As a business, they also needed to remain profitable, and they needed to protect themselves as 2/3 of their workforce migrated to working from home with the significant increase in cyber threats. So a lot of challenges, massive change. And they admitted themselves that they were ill prepared. They could have been better prepared, and they'd admit this as well. If you look at the UK Cabinet Office Risk Register, they have there as the most likely and the highest impact risk being a pandemic every 5 years. This organization also has a pandemic contingency plan, but this is something that had been written probably during SARS and MERS. It was on the shelf, it was out of date, it was unpracticed. So we provided direct support and engagement. We established structure and battle rhythm and mentored the senior leadership through that peak of the crisis. We also helped to blue team where plans were non-existent or were lacking, to red team or stress test existing plans, and we wargamed a variety of scenarios. The leadership of their organization very rapidly adjusted, and an enduring crisis management response was established. Now, within the energy sector, they have been, well, it's been widely commented on how well they've actually responded. They are now in the process of transforming the way they do regular business to adapt to this pandemic. And also through necessity, they have to increase footfall again on their sites, particularly when they're running the mandatory statutory outages, the big maintenance schedules. But they've evolved. They've also evolved to establish enduring capabilities, such as an outbreak management team and their own internal outbreak testing team. And for this, Public Health England has actually held them up as an example of excellent practice. So we're currently at this point helping them now design and run exercises to test their outbreak responses on sites and prepare them for successful outages. So this is just one example, I think, again, of a resilient and evolving response. So to sum up then, and that's a very quick canter through a couple of examples. I wish I had time to go into slightly more detail. I've tried to focus on positive examples here from the crisis and to illustrate a prepare, dare, and evolve mindset. We work closely with these clients as trusted advisors, and we serve to the senior executives as a critical friend. All had leadership buy-in and drive behind it, and a determination to invest to improve their organizational performance. This is important because leadership done well adds value where and when it counts. It develops and builds in resilience. It improves an organization's potential. It reduces those frictions I spoke of, and it ups the performance levels. I think personally on the back of this crisis, and Gareth alluded to this, he talked about running internal business reviews. Well, this is all about introspection. I think it's a good time for everybody to indulge in a bit of introspection. What are your critical capabilities? Do you feel this crisis has exposed areas of weakness or areas of opportunity? Are you prepared to invest in developing your potential? I've expressed personal views based on these three examples. I think they represent successful, robust, and agile crisis response, and that they pave the way for transformation. But I'm going to leave you to draw your own conclusions on that. I'd like you to consider one final thought before I move on. Contingency planning and leadership development always look expensive when you do it and cheap when you need it. Leon, that's me. Would you like me to introduce Timo at this point?
I'll tell you what, Ivor, what I'm going to, I'll hand back to you to introduce Timo. I just want to pull out a few points and maybe run a poll with the audience before we do that. But Thank you so much for that. Firstly, as people living in South Africa, we heard you talking about the utilities. We're very keen to introduce you to Eskom to see what we can do there in terms of helping us help them keep the lights on. But I'm hearing some key themes that really transcend across all sectors of the economy, from a tertiary education institution to a consumer electronics business to a national utility. Leadership is at the core, which is often seen as a soft skill. But the need for leadership, the need for wargaming preparation, and actually the UK had already identified a pandemic as fifth on their risk register. I wonder how many of us, if we have a risk register, had a pandemic on there in terms of our business continuity. So I think they're just points to reflect. I'll remind the audience, and I can see people are already asking for introductions to Berwicks, which we will facilitate. There are a few questions, Cecilia, which I think we'll come back on to maybe after Timo. But maybe we could run the first poll here in terms of what are we seeing in our own organizations, in our own context. What are the greatest areas of weakness within our organizations at the moment? Could you run that? Yeah. So just be great to get the audience's view on that. And Timo, while that's there, perhaps you could tee up your slides and Ivor can introduce you.
Okay. That's great. Look, it really is a pleasure for me to be able to introduce Timo Rylander. Through no fault of his own, Timo was born on the wrong side of the old Berlin Wall. He actually spent a bit of time in the East German military for one period. I can absolutely guarantee he is not a Stasi spy. He's got an extremely distinguished career in the fields of strategy and business transformation. He studied in Germany and California, and he was actually a Fulbright scholar. He's won awards for the work he's done with businesses. Now, if I were to run through a list of Timo's business successes, we'd be here all day. And frankly, I'd end up feeling fairly insignificant. So I won't. But Timo, in short, is globally experienced with extensive hands-on executive and management consultancy experience. He's got an outstanding track record in leadership, driving change, building, growing, and leading organizations to success. What he's going to do is discuss risk management and transformation based on his experiences over this recent crisis with one of our clients. Timo, over to you.
Thanks, Ivor, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. And after that introduction, I don't really know if I want to be here anymore because it can only go downhill. What I'd like to do is maybe focus on a little bit on the balance between managing a crisis, getting through that on one hand, and then setting your sights on the longer term implications and the long term success of a business. As we've both, Gareth and Ivor both alluded to that already. There's any number of quotes out there that basically all say the same thing. Great fortunes, great successes are made in times of crisis, right? So, I mean, Jack Welch once said, never miss an opportunity like a Great Depression. And I think that businesses don't often think about it that way because the operational requirements and the immediate crisis feels so close to the canoe. But the question, of course, then becomes, well, what does it take to actually turn the crisis into an opportunity? And very simply speaking, I would propose maybe there's four things that all sound simple, but of course are very difficult to do. First is, of course, protect the core, right? So protect your business by all means. And see what it takes to keep that afloat, and that requires understanding the risks and controlling them. And I'll get into that in a moment. But it also requires identifying and seizing the opportunities that present themselves, and the opportunities will be unique in a time of crisis, right? That is, I think, the most important element of these types of situations. They're not everyday situations. Therefore, the opportunities that present themselves are not everyday opportunities. And smart businesses will look at those and take advantage of that with an aim to come out strong on the other side. And then the fourth one is to act decisively. And again, I think Gareth was saying that management stands in their own way sometimes, and I think that's true. There is you can sort of use images and say, well, do you want to be the hedgehog that sort of rolls up into a spiky ball and waits until everything's over, and hopefully there's still a world around it, or do you sort of become something more of a tiger that pounces on the opportunity and tries to actually get something out of it for itself. I want to pick out 2 points, the one about risk and then the one about opportunities with examples that we've actually worked on. On the risk side, I have a couple of pet peeves when it comes to risk management. And I suspect most of you here will have some form of risk management in your organizations, and you may have a process and you may have a risk matrix, etc. The one thing that really I think people miss in risk management typically is they treat risks as being in isolation, right? So you have these bubbles on your risk matrix, and then you have somebody responsible for each bubble, and you expect them to do something about it. That is, to put it bluntly, that is short-sighted, because risks don't exist in isolation. Risks are connected to each other. And the most obvious example is, just like in your value chain, your operations determine how your financials do in the end. The same goes for risks. So operational risks will have financial implications and will impact your financial risk. A reputation risk that you might have will most likely kick through to your employee base and to your workforce morale as well. And so what often happens, in my observation at least, is when companies do risk management, they look at these risks and say, well, I've got that under control and I've got that under control, and I've just found a way to push it out of the red into the yellow, or out of the yellow into the green, and now I feel good about myself. When in fact, due to these connections between risks, you may have something happen that doesn't look particularly severe, but it will kick off other things. And you can argue that that's actually how crises often develop. And so I think there is a deeper analysis and deeper skill often needed in risk management. It's often a tick box exercise. The second element there that I think companies don't do well enough often is, who is responsible for the risk in the end? It's not some person who has the title risk manager, it's the management. Right? Risk management is a management task and should be daily on the management agenda. And it's also not a matter of avoid, right? So risks are bad and therefore we have to try to manage them all down. That goes against the idea of entrepreneurialism, right? So what management, in my opinion, needs to do more of is really understand the risk landscape rather than mapping it out, and understanding where the risks and where the opportunities lie, right? Because being an entrepreneur, being in a business means to take risks. That's inherent in the nature of a business. It's just a question of which ones do we take and why and how. And that segues into the second point I'd like to make about the opportunities. We have, and I'm going to share a visual here very briefly just to help make that point, if I can find the button to do that. Like I said earlier, you want to protect the core, but you also need to look at the opportunities that present themselves. And you should be able to see my screen now. Ivor, I can see you, so if you could nod to confirm. Okay, very good. So this is the way we've structured the Corona recovery effort at one of our clients. And you'll see the short-term arrow at the top there. It's essentially the main effort. So that's protecting the core. That's about making sure that business keeps running, or we can turn it back on. We turn it back on in an orderly manner, organizing how people return to the office, organizing how we maintain the social distancing in the office, organizing how people report on the travel, family travel, and all of that stuff. That is very, very operational and relevant, of course. But with that client, we've also set aside some resources to look at the other two streams. The second one down, we call it tactical opportunities. That is really looking at quick fixes and changes that a business can make as a result of the operational model that they've been forced into. So from one of our clients, for instance, they have now switched to so one thing they have to do is they procure complicated parts and equipment from other manufacturers, and they have to go and do on-site inspections of those in order to determine whether or not they're produced correctly and meet the tolerances and can be shipped to the plants for installation. They have shifted to doing that online now with high-definition cameras and defined processes, etc. And of course, then the question becomes, well, why don't we always do that? right? It saves costs, it makes things quicker, it reduces certain risks associated with travel, etc. So these are the types of things that we try to capture in these tactical opportunities. And it goes back maybe to the independent business review that Gareth was talking about. We are forced to do things differently now. And some of that we probably want to get rid of again as soon as we can. Some of that we should keep. It's instant opportunity. And we call them tactical because, again, it's relatively easy to realize them and make them permanent because we're already doing them. It may require some technical upgrades and things like that. And then most importantly, actually, is, in the third arrow down, there's strategic opportunity. So this particular client of ours, after sort of going through the initial crisis response, he very quickly turned around and said, actually, I want to come out stronger on the other side. So he had that sort of opportunity view right from the beginning. And so these strategic opportunities, that turned out to be pretty much a out-of-the-box effort of a handful of people that we facilitated, and where we looked at all kinds of crazy ideas of what could we do now, right? What kind of things might be opportunities that present themselves. And we used initially, and I'll share that very quickly. So we did, based on a risk review, we did a bit of a scenario analysis. There's more detail behind each of those, but it's a typical best case, medium case, extreme case thing. But then we looked at a 1 year and 5 year time horizon and said, what will happen to our business environment if? And I think we can already dismiss the best case. That seems to be unrealistic now. But the point of these scenarios is actually not to predict the future. The point of the scenarios is to play through in your head, and you may call it wargaming. What would the business environment look like, and how should I be set up if something like that materializes, and what can I learn from this? We also looked at their client industries. So on this chart, we've mapped out short-term impact of the crisis across and vertically the long-term impact. So if somebody is placed in the upper right-hand corner, like the communication sector here, they will benefit short-term and long-term. If somebody is in the left lower corner there, those are industries that will probably suffer for quite a while. Never mind the bubble size, that has to do with the importance of that particular sector as the client industry to our client. But we played through all of these things, and as a result of that, determined what some of the opportunities might be. And then final quick visual. This is sanitized, of course. So the descriptions in the bubbles may not mean that much to you. But the point of this is we've identified a whole host of things that we could do now as a result of this crisis situation that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to do. So things on the financial side, for instance, in terms of buying back some of the bonds that are outstanding because they were trading 70 cents to the dollar. There's things in there like heavily investing in the greener space, if you will, because some of those companies will be strapped for cash and they will struggle. There's things in there like taking over adjacent businesses to complete our puzzle piece collection for the value chain, etc. Right? So while the business was very strongly focused and has been very strongly focused on recovering from the crisis and doing the right things and protecting the business and protecting the markets and managing the operating costs and all of that stuff, there was quite a bit of effort dedicated from the beginning to figuring out what are the opportunities that are presenting themselves. We can't do all of them. Obviously, some of them will compete for capital, some of them will compete for resources, some of them will not be realistic. But the point is, open up the box, get these things out there, get the senior management team discussing them. We now have individual teams on all of these little bubbles, basically doing feasibility analyses, etc. Some of them have already been implemented, so certain hedging deals have already been put in place, etc. So that the business actually uses this situation to better itself. And final thought, maybe, and I can turn off the screen sharing for that. Final thought, I think, for me is a type of crisis is an opportunity to implement and drive changes that you knew you had to do anyway, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be cost cutting, but it can be these strategic shifts. For instance, again, the green trend, which probably is here to stay, and other things. You have a burning platform, as they say, and so you might as well use this opportunity now to do some of the shifts and changes that otherwise you would have had to argue over. Otherwise, you would have had to go through long processes for, etc. You don't have the luxury of time. You need to act decisively, as I mentioned earlier, and I think actually looking at a crisis from that perspective helps you with the survival as well, because you're not just focused on your feet. You're starting to look up and out, and you're giving people perspective as well. You display to your stakeholders, to your employees, to your shareholders, that you're actually having the business in hand and you're moving forward. And I think that's important. Apart from the factual actions, there is an element here I think that's important, and it's connected to leadership, which is to show to your stakeholders that you're in control of the business and that you're working on maintaining it. Yeah, and with that, short of time, short of my target actually, I'll pause.
Timo in Zurich, thank you so much. And thank you to Ivor and to Gareth for kicking us off. And it really talks to some themes that we've explored throughout the Chamber community for the last few months. And really, the first businesses to fail were those that had pre-existing conditions. So in many senses, it's easier to lead in a crisis because people are listening to you. They understand from the external context that the world has changed and we need to adapt. In many ways, one could argue in the military, when bullets start flying, people are going to look to somebody to lead them. When things are normal and a steady state, perhaps it's even harder to lead. And I believe that's when we've got to build that trust, develop the leaders, develop our policies to ensure that when crisis hits or the circumstances change, people trust us and they'll pivot quickly with us. I think we've seen in South Africa, one could debate how much trust we've had in the government over the last 9 years, so that when there's a current draconian change of legislation, do we feel our best interests are at heart? And I think that's the same in business. If you've not been communicating with your team, not been engaging, not been leading through inspiration, when things become very difficult, that trust, it's too late to build it. Which kind of, let's explore the first poll. And what we're going to then do is break into some topics and have a discussion. And I again encourage you to pose some questions. Perhaps, Ema, you could show us the results from the first poll. And I'll read them out for the benefit of the video recording. What are the areas of greatest weakness within your organization at the moment, or that have been exposed by COVID? So lack of contingency planning is about a quarter. A reluctance to embrace tech, 28%. Over-reliance on specific product, service, client sector. Lack of diversification, 33%. FX controls, 6%. Constricted cash flows, 40%, the highest one there. And poor leadership, 22%. So we can see that constricted cash flows could be about people not preparing for a rainy day, but poor leadership, lack of contingency planning, and lack of agility really is about a quarter of the issues that we've seen. Really moving on from there, looking at, thanks, Ema. Pandemics aren't anything new. They've existed before. They were number 5 on the UK's risk register. We've had SARS, MERS, swine flu. But our response from the media has been quite different. On a community and a global level, this seems to have changed dramatically. The global response to COVID has been unprecedented. So what does this mean in terms of our SOPs, our standard operating procedures, our compulsory policies in times of pandemics, contingency plans, and perhaps practical things like how to budget, forecast, prepare for this? Has this global response set a precedent for future pandemic responses? And do you feel that governments are going to feel similar pressure to maintain these draconian lockdown policies, or are they going to be more agile to adapt? And I open that to the panel. Perhaps Gareth, Ivor, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Leon, very quickly then, I suppose. I'll address each of your questions very quickly. I know other people have things to say. In terms of SOPs and compulsory policies, we deal with clients that work in highly regulated environments. The high hazard industries have to be. Now, I've had the joy this last week of going through our own internal audits for the last 3 days, included in which is occupational health and safety standards, which need to be met. I can see these changing. I can see if this this is an enduring pandemic, and already you're seeing changes in workplace requirements. What level of involvement there'll be from regulators such as the health and safety executive. So, for example, with one of our clients, there was a death on site from COVID-19, and the first people who started asking questions was the health and safety executive. Was there accountability for this? Is there liability associated with it? Could this have been prevented and avoided? This sort of thing is going to become increasingly common, particularly in those environments and fields where there is that type of scrutiny. So I think it's going to, for a start, change occupational health and safety requirements. Enduring capabilities, I mentioned the example there of the one client developing their own deployable operational testing team capability. So this is not waiting for external people to come in and do the testing and tracking and tracing. This is so that they can be preemptive, get off on the front foot, and try and pinch these spikes off at source before they can grow. And there's going to be massive workplace changes. Just over the last few years, there's been an increase in the hot desking concept and the idea of these big shared floor plates and all the rest of it. All that's going to go out the window from what I can see at the moment. And clients that we work with are all at the moment looking at how they can restructure and reconfigure their office and their working space, and the working from home piece as well. It's going to have a big impact. It's going to be huge savings for some people. So I think that is going to impact SOPs, and I think there will be compulsory, certainly health and safety policies that come to bear that companies are going to have to adhere to. On the contingency plan side, I'll just use one example very quickly. We could talk about this all day, but with some of the clients that we work with, mandatory outages, deep dive maintenance on turbines and things like that, and turnarounds of plants and sites. I mentioned the one where there was a 14 million saving by shaving off some of the time. You need to plan for these. You need to budget this in. So if you budget in a statutory outage and it's in your budget, but every day you run over is going to cost you between $1 million and $2 million, which is a fact. That's what it does. It costs between $1 million and $2 million to overrun on an outage. And it may cost you £500,000 to invest in the contingency planning necessary to have the mitigations in place, the wargaming and the synchronization matrices and all the rest of it. But the budgeteers, the people who pull the finance strings, won't allow for any more expense, in this one example, to spend on planning for the outages. Now, if an outage overruns by 10 days, that's anywhere between 10 and 20 million that's been spent in excess of what was expected. Whereas instead they could have spent 1 million doing better preparation and putting in place the contingencies, and save themselves, 9 million or 9.5 million. You see the point? So, like I said earlier, contingency planning looks expensive when you're doing it, but cheap when you actually need it. And then, finally, in terms of the pandemic itself, yes, governments are going to have to, they've all got pandemic plans. I told you the Cabinet Office Risk Register had it as the highest likelihood, highest impact was every 5 years a flu-like pandemic. It's really difficult to plan for these things because where do you take the money to invest in PPE that you have to destroy every few years because of shelf life? Are you going to take it from the national health? Are you going to take it from education? It's a difficult balance, but I think a lot of lessons are going to be learned from this, both in terms of preparation, contingency planning, and the decision-making process, which, let's face it, has not been a shining example in many instances. Sorry if I rambled on, but just wanted
to... That's the rich content that we want, and I think it's really interesting in terms of where do you take the budget from. In South Africa with the depleting fiscus, that's an even bigger challenge in terms of where we deploy those funds. And then the veracity of those funds and how they're spent is another challenge. It discourages people from raising capital for these events. And when do you invest the time? So I shared with you all last night that Wimbledon have made 141 million from their insurance payout for Wimbledon being cancelled this year. But they've spent 2 million a year for the last 20 years in terms of investing in insurance. And for me, insurance is investing in your leadership, investing in your culture, investing in your policies, because you might not need them until you have a crisis, but they will carry you through that crisis. I'd just like to direct it to Gareth, because something that came out of the poll and that question I raised, cash flow being a real constricting factor. What have you seen there, Gareth, from a South African business context? And then again, feel free to answer more broadly on those other themes.
I mean, ultimately what we found in the South African market looking at these businesses is that typically, in terms of your cash flow spectrum, your weak cash flow tends to point towards insolvencies. So the guys, and technical insolvencies over there as well. Obviously, it's key, and it's, I suppose crunch and probably the most crucial aspect of a business. And what we found in the South African marketplace is not many companies sit on top of their money. As they come in, they declare dividends and they burn through the cash as quickly as possible. When they hit these rainy days, unfortunately, they've tapped out. But the vast majority of companies live in the overdraft facilities. So that's unfortunately where we're seeing things at this point in time. Generally you find companies that have got a good, strong, good cash flow in terms of a spectrum over there. Generally they're fairly successful, but they do go underneath the wire at some point in time. And that always comes down to a good board, a good financial director, and good turnaround team inside. Just touching on a point raised earlier by Ivor, and I suppose there's been this notion, we talk in the South African context for a second, but there's been a notion that when someone says we're doing a restructuring, we're doing a turnaround, the automatic presumption is that you're distressed or that you're, insolvent. It's not necessarily the case. It's actually the right attitude is you should be doing restructurings and turnarounds well before the time. The prudent director looking into the future will see the trouble hitting them 6 months, 9 months, 12 months down the line. Start the process sooner than later. And the reason why business rescue generally fails in the South African marketplace, and let's face it, business rescue has become a wipe the slate clean sense in the rand compromise. And it's picked up a good reputation, but primarily a bad reputation in certain circles. And the reason why it doesn't work is that the majority of these companies are dead on arrival. It's sort of like taking a corpse to an undertaker and saying, please resuscitate. I know it's a very bad analogy, but that's effectively what we're finding. Directors are sitting in denial. And unfortunately, the wrath will come when directors will have to face their liabilities and their duties in terms of the Companies Act. So that will come.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Gareth. Timo, any insights from your world?
Yeah, very quick one though. I think in terms of turnaround, I think maybe Gareth and Ivor, you're talking about two different things. Gareth, I think you're talking about the business turnaround, whereas I think Ivor was referencing the planned outage in a production facility where you take it down and you do maintenance on it, right? And that's a planned process, and that costs a certain amount of money. But back to your question, Leon, I think because you asked, government preparedness and so on, and I think there's likely to be an overreaction, and it's going to be expensive, right? So having learned the lessons that we've learned, I can see at least some countries and also some companies going overboard now with stockpiles, with requiring tracing, with all kinds of things that we wouldn't have had, and we probably as citizens wouldn't have accepted before. And there's a risk that we overcompensate and that we do things that aren't required and that are costly. So in our scenario analysis, for instance, one thing that I've included there is a risk that while we may see tax reductions, for instance, in the short term to stimulate the economy, we may eventually have to pay for all this, and that will have to come from somewhere. And actually, in the long run, taxes may go up again, right? So there's certain implications here that maybe we're not quite thinking through yet. Also in terms of macroeconomics, right? So we're focusing on individual businesses, but I think the macroeconomics that will play out as a result of this. Also, supply chain organization, dependency, right? So how willing am I still to have a single supplier for critical parts? How willing am I to ship things across the entire world to save a little bit on production costs when a disruption in the shipping lines or anything like that, it disrupts my business, and then I end up with cash flow constraint, right? So I think businesses will start looking harder at their contingencies and at spreading risks and maybe not having all eggs in one basket anymore.
Yeah. I think, Timo, before I move on to the next topic, you've triggered a couple of very interesting points there. I think, firstly, for me, my major concerns throughout this whole crisis has been the macroeconomic concerns, the business concerns, and the social dislocation. I was looking at a report from the Actuarial Society of South Africa, raised in Stellenbosch yesterday, looking at the effects of lockdown and the actual health outcomes and deaths caused by COVID versus the deaths and social degradation caused by the impacts of lockdown. And there's a strong debate suggesting that it's been more harmful from a healthcare perspective. So the macroeconomics really are important. And I really want to know, why has the media driven this agenda? Why have governments taken this stance when 2 million children die a year from malnutrition in Africa, which far exceeds the death toll of COVID? And that's something that, again, is no one's really answered that question clearly. And secondly, to your point, Timo, we're an organization here that celebrates international trade, multilateral trade. We rely on international supply chain, international mobility. How do we see that impacting this new world of business? So perhaps a comment on each of you, particularly around the media response and the government's draconian responses versus their response to other epidemics. Back to you, Ivor. Oh, sorry, okay. Timo.
No, go ahead, Ivor, go ahead.
Leon, I have to be careful what I say here, because I have a fairly bilious perspective on the way the media have handled this. I mean, I'm a real fan of history, and history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if you look back at things like the Spanish flu, which killed, and I know it's a trite argument, people shy away from it. Oh, you can't compare one with the other. It's not a flu, whatever the case may be. But if you look back at the Spanish flu, this was people coming out of 4 years of crisis, a world war, millions dead, massive impact on economies, and 20 to 100 million, whatever the final figure is, then dying over the next couple of years, including from the healthiest, in the second wave. But what was the difference then? Well, maybe a more resilient mindset and approach. People were slightly more robust, but we also didn't have social media and the same sort of media presence that we have today. I think out of all the industries that have come out of this, perhaps slightly tarnished, some of the mainstream media and some of the social media has been amongst the worst. I've seen in a lot of media reporting a lack of objectivity and almost a rabid desire to score points and be seen to be holding the governments and the politicians to account and trying to trip them up without providing solutions or reporting the positives. The Nightingale hospitals, and that was a really good government response, and it was a fantastic example of both public and private sector coming together to deliver within 10 days or whatever it was, these incredible Nightingale hospitals. This was building our capacity to be able to deal with a big surge in cases here in the UK, so we could protect the NHS. And of course, we never had to fill those hospitals. And there was negative reporting about that this was a waste of time and money. For heaven's sake, did people want those hospitals to be filled? So I think some of the impact that the media has had, first of all, in scaremongering, and of course we have to protect ourselves and protect society and protect the vulnerable and those with comorbidities. There are probably better ways to do it. We're still discovering that. We're still working it out. We're still working out the solutions, and the decision-making process is still ongoing. But I think a lot of the media reporting led to poor knee-jerk decision-making from political leaders as well, and created a degree of enduring negativity. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question or if I've just gone on a rant.
No, that's something that I know we've discussed, and I know Cecilia's raised in previous webinars and feels very passionately about. And I think if we look at examples of leadership throughout history, whereas you can take Churchill, you can take Her Majesty the Queen, we can take Thatcher, whatever you think of their politics opposition, taking unpopular decisions with a long-term view to benefiting the societies in which they serve to lead. And perhaps our leadership has not been sufficiently robust and been quick to react to social media and 24-hour news cycles. But perhaps Gareth and Timo and Cecilia, you'd like to comment on that media angle, and then we're going to move on and explore leadership, because there's some quite interesting observations already emerging.
I think if I can just jump in here and also just flag a question that we've had from Sharon Constanson in the UK. I think it just feeds into it. We've seen this before. It's now played out. We're still in the thick of it. I think it's a question of people are starting to wonder about trust in leadership in a whole different way. And that's what Sharon also is asking is, do we believe, and we can, if the panel can address this too in their answers, do we actually believe that decision makers today will deal with risk more effectively in the future than they did pre-COVID? And I think it boils down to trust. Do you think people learn from mistakes, or don't they? Or do they learn, but then they get sidetracked by what the media is saying, and there's always some different interference making them scared to act or scared to act decisively? I do think everyone here will probably have a different take on this from what you've seen. Gareth, particularly, you deal with people who are in crisis mode or think they're in crisis mode when really the game is over. It's played. What do you see? Do you see that people are learning and adapting? This is an interesting thing to hear from the panel as well.
It really comes down to corporate culture and what's bred into them. You know, and the difficulty, you talk about good leadership in these times. Good leadership will know how to pull their team through a storm. Under bad leadership, you end up losing your good soldiers, so to speak. And if you lose them, effectively, you start losing the engine room of the company, and that effectively is on a one-way ticket, you know, southwards, which is not always good. When you look at transparency, I think there's degrees of transparency. From a board perspective, I think you also need to be careful about what you're being transparent about, because there's information which I don't believe that you should be feeding down the chain to employees. I don't think that they're privy to it. I don't think they should, because while you think it may be good news to them, they will always take it in a state of, you know, economic crisis to being a negative. And effectively, so if you're saying, for example, we brought an overdraft down of the company from 100 million down to presumably 50 million, but a month ago you cut salaries in light of COVID. You think it's a positive, and you've been transparent as the board to the employee. They're going to say, you're stealing from me, you're taking away my salary because you're trying to get rid of your liability. So, you know, from a transparency point, as I say, it's a good thing, but you've got to be careful in the message that you're sending out. And as you know, the bulk of the majority of, you know, good CEOs and of companies generally tend to be psychopaths. They're not interested in people below them. It's about them and and they live in a state of denial. So they don't mind losing everything at the expense of the company. They'll start again. So you've got to be careful. It really comes down to personalities at the end of the day, and culture. So as I say, be careful what you wish for is always the parting comment there.
Yeah. Do we have a poll about how many of us have worked for psychopaths before? Perhaps that's a different theme, but there is empirical data to back that up.
That would be an interesting poll, actually. I can say I've worked for one who is not presently on this panel.
I wondered where we were going there. Timo, do you have any comments on that before I'm going to shift it very much to talk about?
Yeah, and I want to pick up on something that Cecilia has mentioned about the distractions. I do think that people genuinely want to learn from experience, just for the sake of not having to have the embarrassment of going through the same thing again, right? But I think there's a substantial difference between publicly traded businesses and private businesses, and I think that distinction is the degree of distraction and external pressures that you're under. So private businesses, speaking from experience, may have, you know, internal family issues and what have you, but they do have one luxury, which is they don't have to report on a quarterly basis and then have to be scrutinized by investors and media on why they've made this and that decision and why the numbers don't look as good as they had promised, etc. It limits long-term thinking, and especially because then, of course, management incentive plans are tied to share price developments and all of that stuff, and now you create an incentive to dress up the numbers if you want, right? So, you know, the average CEO in a listed company may have a shelf life of 5 or 6 years, and in those 5 or 6 years, they have an incentive to do something that makes the numbers look good, which is not necessarily the same thing as making the business prosper, right? Yeah. And so I think those distractions do come in, and I do think that maybe after some initial, you know, we've sort of taken a look at our situation, and we do want to invest in resilience and crisis preparedness and all these things now. There is a risk that when it looks expensive, as Ivor said, they start going out the window again. And you know, not really sure how to fix this. I think it has to do simply with how people are incentivized and how they define their personal success in sort of connection with the business success, right? So the only other quick comment I wanted to make on the media, even though maybe that sort of doesn't really fit the topic today, but in spite of where I was born, I generally believe in markets, and I think, you know, the media today are a bit like intellectual fast food, and we in the grand scheme, we as consumers, we get what we ask for, or we get what we consume, right? So I think in a way, just like it is with, you know, buying sustainable products and stuff like that, I think consuming information maybe we as consumers need to vote with our feet a little bit more, and you know, do what, if there's something we can do, but to bring sort of quality journalism back, because I think the media do have a role, but because again they're in a market and they're competing with each other, they get into this 24-hour cycle or even faster than that, and substance goes amiss in the whole process. Right, and then again, you know, these are external pressures on businesses who now have to justify themselves and have crisis communications and all of that stuff. So somehow it feels like we're in this ever accelerating treadmill, and that's why I'm a fan of private businesses, frankly, because they have an easier way out of these.
Yeah, I think thanks, Timo. I think actually the diversity of this panel lends itself very richly to what we're discussing here. You know, Timo, I didn't realize you're from East Germany, which is, you know, I lived in West Germany in the early 80s, and I remember staring at the wall and wondering what the other side was. But a lot of the South African ideology is based on that Soviet-style state-controlled running of the economy, as was much of the apartheid regime, which is quite interesting. And here we are in South Africa, Switzerland, out of these backgrounds, and the UK, looking at economic models and how they might change. I think what we're all talking about is the importance of leadership. And interestingly, some of the best examples of leadership on a macro-political scale have been demonstrated by women leaders and women leadership teams. And I remember doing board advisory work in 2008, when a lot of the organizations coming out of the crisis were those that had a high representation of women on their boards and more diversity. And interesting, I work with a team of brilliant women. Cecilia runs the chamber with me. We have Sharon on the line who runs the SA chamber. There's something about the making of leadership teams and the training of them, which kind of takes us on to our next point. And I think we have a poll which I'd like to run, just in terms of, that's really going to explore, you know, our views on leadership. But, you know, how ready are our leaders for crisis response? And what are some of the best responses we've seen from governments, but also from particular business cases? And here, I think this is really important. You know, do we select and train our leadership to be leaders, including proper succession planning, which will involve leadership development, or are most of our leaders there by default? And perhaps it would be great to get the audience feedback while we address that topic. How ready have leaders been for this response? What are the worst examples? What are the best examples, indeed, in politics, but also indeed in business? And maybe Gareth, you could kick us off, if you may, with some examples from South Africa. You're just on mute there. Yeah.
Yeah, my connection dropped there for a moment. I didn't catch the last bit there.
So just looking at the best examples of leadership and the worst examples that we've seen in South Africa. I mean, we can talk about politics, but also specifically in business.
You know, Leon, it's incredibly difficult at this point in time. You know, we look at the old Steinhoff. Everyone thought that Steinhoff was great leadership, and we saw what came out of that stable. You know, so, I mean, for me to tell you now, hand on heart, what is a good, you know, shining light of good leadership in terms of a company in South Africa, I think it's very difficult to put the peg in the ground, firmly stand there without one of your audience members wanting to sue me down the line if they invest in shares. But look, I mean, it's difficult times. I think we're pretty much in uncharted territory where we are moving forward. I think globally we're in trouble, generally in terms of, I suppose, international trade and so forth. So I think, you know, in terms of good leadership, you know, you can put whatever policies, procedures in place into a company. It's all good and well written on paper unless you're enforcing it. You know, we've looked at, you know, the fatal flaws of King 3 at the time. We've looked at King 4, and King 4 has its pitfalls as well. So, you know, really, I suppose it comes down to your moral compass as a board, ultimately at the end of the day, and keeping people in line and in check. But I think you need to have a proper system of checks and balances in place in every organization and company. And I think you need to keep your finger firmly on the pulse. A good CEO and a good board of directors will keep their fingers firmly on the pulse. A few years ago, I acted for a company. It was probably one of the most hostile boards of directors. It was a multinational conglomerate. But I must tell you, when you sat in the meeting, that board of directors, there was no pleasantries among the directors. And it was probably very awkward for me to attend because we were discussing quite a very sensitive legal issue and matter at hand. And I recall two of the directors shouting at one another, telling them what they'll do to them after the meeting if they don't shut up and stop interrupting one another. But ultimately, they made the right decision as the board. They sat there and they thrashed it out. They had the awkward discussion in a boardroom meeting. They thrashed it out, but they came out of there. The company ended up turning a new leaf in the corner in its entirety. But as they walked out of that meeting, the directors still shook hands and they said, moving forward, well, let's still have to work together. Very friendly in corridor chat after that. There was no backstabbing. And I think they adopted a corporate culture that, you know, there were no behind closed door discussions. Everything was done in a forum among the directors. That was where every item gets thrashed out. You may not like what they said, but they were very transparent. They were subsequently acquired by another international company from Australia after that. So, you know, it turned out well for the directors. Luckily, they made a good amount of money.
That's really interesting in terms of robust relationships can be very constructive and being willing to have those uncomfortable conversations. Ivor, I'd be really interested to get your views on good examples of leadership you've seen, but also perhaps from a leadership development perspective, what organizations can do to ensure they have the right leadership in place at the right time.
Yeah, how much time have you got?
Yeah, I think we're good for another hour or so.
This is
5 minute version. Yeah.
Look, this is a huge topic, and I could talk all day about it. My perspective, of course, because I've got a caveat by giving it that this is my view, and it's the world according to Ivor Gardiner is not necessarily the case, but this is my experience of it. We've all experienced toxic leadership. We've all seen examples of toxic leadership. The military wasn't exempt from it. I saw plenty of that in my time in the military career. Worst thing about toxic leaders is they never recognize it. Invariably, they think they're the epitome of good leadership. But the example, so the guy I referred to earlier, the fellow South African MD of this global electronic company, took over in a company which was not in profit, should have been, had every reason to be in profit, but wasn't. This is for the EMEA branch. And nobody was talking to each other. Nobody was making decisions because it had been so toxic that the only person who got to make decisions was the bloke who'd been in charge. And he saw how essential it was going to be to turn that around. He did get outside help for that. So I think that is the first step in developing your leadership. It's first of all, making it a specific intent of yours. If you're in charge, is that you recognize the importance of your leadership and mentoring and developing people, choosing the right people and mentoring them through and having that succession planning in place. It was too big a task for him to do his own job, which is often the case. And it's often the reason that people get consultancies in, because we can come in with an external perspective and just dedicate time to that. This is working at every single level in that organization and helping them to break down those silos, empower them, because suddenly they were being given mission command. He was stating his intent. He was giving them the freedom to make decisions within their remit, not have to come to him for every single decision. Suddenly they had freedoms that they'd never had before. And most of them didn't actually know what to do with those freedoms. So this had to be, this was a culture change that had to be trained into them and developed. And a lot can be done on this. But of course, people do balk because this is a cost to a business on paper anyway. They look at this is like training or security. This is going to cost us money. This is not increasing our margins. But it's understanding the long-term impact on that, which is what he did. He realized he needed to invest. Now, within his first year, he took the business into profit. And he did that because he changed the culture and the mindset, and that came through leadership. If I use the three stool, we all know the three stool theory. And I talked about us trying to improve businesses' output and performance and the rest of it. So if this is the performance stool and your three legs of people, plans, and process, because really that's what drives everything. If you've got good people, well-trained, trusted, who know their job and get on with things. If you invest in planning and it's collaborative planning and everybody's involved in that, you've got contingency plans in place, people are prepared, and then if you've got good empowering processes in place. But the thing that binds all, that binds all those three legs together is leadership. It keeps the alignment, it keeps it driving, and you need that good leadership there to drive it through. I would say, good leadership in a crisis looks like good leadership, full stop. If you invested in leadership in your organization and you have good, strong, enduring leadership, when the crisis comes along, all those other bits will be in place, and they should probably be good leaders in a crisis as well.
I think you say something important. I'm going to come to Timo, and then we're going to do a poll, and then Cecilia has some questions. But I think you talk about mission command, and for the broader audience, that is whereby you set your intent. This is what we need to achieve, but you do not micromanage your team how to get there. And one of the transitions I made coming out of the military, and you talked about culture, but hiring the right people, is sometimes when you don't tell people exactly what to do, they do the minimum. If you talk to an individual's highest self and see the best in them, but they actually don't want to do their best, you've got the hiring process wrong. So I think a lot of leadership and culture is about getting the right people around you. And that's where assessment and development of that team is really important as well. So Gareth, come in there. Yeah.
Leon, on that point, if you look at the psychology of a company, you cannot have a company or a corporation full of superstars, because ultimately what you have on your hands is a Real Madrid. On paper they're amazing. I hope there's no Real Madrid supporters, but amazing. But in reality, they just can't score because you have all these alpha egos sitting in a room. We always say you need a good balancing exercise, and sometimes you do need that slacker because ultimately they're the example indirectly for the others. It's a balancing exercise among personalities, and a good leadership will identify strengths and weaknesses. Not everyone may be amazing at a particular task, but work on that within your organization, I suppose.
Yes, it's a great point. I love the sporting analogies, but not unlike the special forces or the military, where you have a bunch of alphas that have all been the best at everything, and somebody has to lead, somebody has to make the team. But I think when you get the culture right, people know that they can still make the team and be recognized and be valued for that role as well, which again, we're going into high performance culture and leadership there. Timo, any observations on that before I move to another poll?
Well, two very quick ones. So the first one, it's obvious, but we often don't talk about it. Leadership requires followership, right? So that goes back to the balancing personalities, I guess, as well. An organization needs to have people who are content with being led, and the better you are as a leader, the more likely you are that they get there, right? Because they feel like you're taking them to a place that they want to be. The other thought, and that goes back to good response and poor response to the crisis. Even though that's not a clear answer, but it's very much dependent on perspective as well, right? So take Boeing, for instance. Right, so Boeing may get something like $17 billion in relief funding, and you may argue, from a company perspective, that's a job well done because they actually had severe issues, long before the COVID crisis, right? Not least the engineering and certification disaster of the 737 MAX. So that company was in trouble. Now COVID hits, and actually COVID presents, well, yes, another existential threat, but also an opportunity to, sweep some of the older problems under the same rug and say, well, we need relief funding in order to get out of our predicament. So from a management perspective, maybe from a shareholder perspective, they've probably done a good job lobbying for the relief funding. But from an economic perspective, that's not necessarily a success, right? Because you're now paying with public money for somebody else's blunders, right? Yeah. And so I think it's something we shouldn't forget in all of this. There's always at least two sides to a perspective, and that makes it also so hard to find a government program where you would say, it's well done, because in the end the money has to come from somewhere, and time will only tell, and probably not 2 years, but maybe 10 years. Will tell whether or not it's been well managed in the end, and whether or not the economy comes out the way it should.
Thanks, Timo. Yeah, no, absolutely. So perhaps we could look at the polls from that second question around leadership. So do you select, develop, and train your leadership to be leaders, including succession planning, or do leaders end up there by default? So yes, we have a formal leadership program, 17%, which is, I would say, dangerously low. We develop our leaders informally, 60%, and a quarter leaders by default, which again, given the crises, given the constantly changing context of VUCA times, that really is an opportunity to future-proof and build better resilience in our organizations by having a more structured approach to leadership and leadership development. Ivor, on that cheeky question around working for psychopaths, do we have something there? Oh, wow. Okay, well, this maybe is slightly fun and it's anonymous, so perhaps we could all, and I believe the panelists are invited to vote on this one as well. Yeah, there we go. Or not, but we can see.
This is not a multiple choice one, Ivor. Where's the order? Oh, okay, all of the above. Right.
We'll see those results shortly. And while that's happening, I know, Cecilia, did you want to come in with a question and observation there? You're just on mute,
Yes, I think both a question and observation, I think tying together. I love that quote. Is it the CEO of what we once knew as Nokia, who said we didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost, that Gareth said at the beginning. And if we look at something like Nokia, and of course we've got the advantage of hindsight, it's 2020, but if we had to war game that from all the panelists, what could or should Nokia have done? In a way, they faced what for them was the Apple pandemic, and they could do, or they felt they could do very little about it. And just the changing nature of technology and possibly underestimating their competitors, who knows? But if this panel had to war game with Nokia, with perfect hindsight and respect to them, what could we learn from that?
So if I can jump in, because Gareth also mentioned Kodak, and I had a very similar experience many years ago when I started working in consulting. The client, I can say that now, was AGFA, so an old photographic film maker that belonged to BASF at the time. And we were called in to do a strategy development with them. And we looked at industry trends, and we looked at technologies, and we looked at where they want to be, and they made the same mistake that Kodak did. So even though we had a futurist speaking at their leadership event and all of that stuff, and we had a scenario that was called the digital grandmother, and this is back in 1997 or 8 or something like that, right? And we said, digital photography might come. It might be so easy that anybody can take pictures. Anybody will take pictures. There will be tons of pictures. And they simply dismissed it. And I think so they're out of business now. And I think the learning from that, to me, even though it's slightly cynical, is sometimes people just can't get over themselves and over their sort of set ways of thinking and how they view the business, or how they view what they think the customer wants, and all of that stuff. So we can work hard at trying to add perspective to these discussions. We can work hard to try to open their eyes. Sometimes we just can't. And like Gareth said, management stands in its own way, and there really is no other way out. And Nokia may have been the same way, gotten overly complacent about their own business model, and not see the trend we're coming.
Yeah.
I think of the parting two words really is stay relevant. Because if you think about it, with Nokia, amazing phones, they just did not keep up with the likes of Apple and with Samsung really at the end of the day. And moving into smartphone technology, I don't think that they were there. The same pretty much holds true with BlackBerry when they were in the marketplace. Amazing software. But again, if you looked at the BlackBerry models all the way through, they did not stay relevant to the consumer and to the market. So I think that's really the ultimate thing, and correctly so, is that when management gets stale, which was the case of Kodak, sometimes you need fresh thinking, fresh ideas, fresh ways. And the one thing you always find in an organization is that you always have, an up-and-coming star that's got these fresh ideas, and they often get shot down because it's not the way to go. We do the old school way of thinking. What's old doesn't always necessarily mean it's right. You've got to look at new ways. And I think, companies, if they are going to survive, look at new ideas, explore them, consider them. Don't just dismiss them. Because ultimately it could be your survival. We look at the gentleman, we've seen the litigation, I'm straying off point, but for example, the individual inside of Vodacom that invented the please call me, it turned out to be a massive money spinner for Vodacom. So small ideas which are ancillary to your core business, as long as you're not deviating out of the known, stay relevant, you could make more money.
Yeah. Observations over.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't compete with Timo with the level of experience he's got within businesses, but there's one very good example that springs to mind, and I draw an analogy with the way we used to do things in terms of planning and wargaming and rehearsing of plans. But this was a company called Texas Instruments. There's a friend of mine in the United States who specifically does business simulations to help organizations. He'll design scenarios to help them with their business thinking. Call them business wargames if you like. But there's a company called Texas Instruments which was really struggling. It had all sorts of different outputs, and I can't remember the specifics of it, but there were lots of competitors operating in similar spaces, that were just outcompeting them. So they were losing margins, they were really struggling, and they were in danger of going out of business. They had a new MD came in, and he turned everything around, and he started to do it with simulation wargaming exercises, if you like, where he sat down, and what he wanted to do was identify those areas where they couldn't compete and where exactly their core delivery was, their core service. And slowly but surely, they started to be able to cut out those areas where they knew they weren't going to be able to compete, and probably were going to end up finishing off the business. And they focused on just one or two core deliverables. And for the first year or two, they took a hit, but then they started coming back into profit, and then they became a mainstay in this one particular field of delivery. So he cut out all those extraneous bits. He cut off the limbs, if you like, and focused on the core that they could work on and develop, and they knew they could outcompete everybody else, and they did. Which I thought was a great example of incorporating wargaming into a business simulation type setting to actually plan, the future trajectory of your business.
Yeah, I can see we're just coming to 12:30 and we've still got much content. So perhaps we can start concluding here. And thanks, Rehlaender from Deloitte. Jamie, great to connect with you again. Look forward to catching up in London. Thanks for lending Ivor for the morning. I think we could go around the panel with some concluding observations and points and maybe some silver linings. We've not got on to, I think, the wargaming piece and where Berwicks can come in and really help you prepare. I think reach out to the chamber, we'll introduce you, and we might do a follow-up session where we can maybe deep dive on that wargaming, blue teaming, red teaming, which is a real practical way to stress test your business. Maybe in your concluding comments, Ivan, you can refer to question 4 in the military planning process, which I think is very relevant. And Gareth, maybe come to you to conclude. And again, I think there's a lot we could explore within the local context. Your experience might be best for people to get in touch with us, then we can refer them to you in a few weeks or so. But what are your concluding comments about the current context and some practical things that our members can do and take away from this?
I think the ultimate point that they need to learn walking out of this is that they need to stay on, keep the finger on the pulse in their own organization as well as ultimately all of their customers. Because ultimately, if they lose a key account, that may be them at the end of the day. Cash flow is king. Ultimately, within their own organization, stay relevant. I think assess their own businesses frequently and explore options to make money in. You need to look at that. You need to look at redundancy within your business, what you don't need, organizational slack, in the sense that if you're sitting with yellow goods you don't need, get rid of it. Get rid of what you don't need and work with what you need to keep your business alive and start planning. Don't do the knee-jerk reaction. I think you need to come out of hibernation and fear of COVID and start planning what's going to happen in the next month, 2 months, 6 months, and 12 months. They need to work towards those goals.
Gareth, thanks, Gareth. Timo, thank you for joining us from Zurich. What are your final observations for our members?
Well, I think, we probably all agree that this isn't over yet, right? And even the places that have started opening up again, a lot of them then revert back to tighter lockdowns, etc. So I think we'll probably bounce back and forth between opening and closing for quite a while. So the disruptiveness will stay around, and that's tough enough to manage. But I would say, be the tiger, not the hedgehog. Look at the opportunities. It's not too late to look at opportunities, right? Some of them may have had a very short window and that may have passed. But in principle, this is a time of opportunity and potential if you do the right things. And if you allow yourself to take your eyes off of your feet for a while and look at the horizon and figure out, how can you become a better business? And I think there's a chance here, as traumatizing as the times may be, and so take a long-term perspective and think strategically.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Timo. That's great advice. And Ivor, perhaps we could come to you. Your final thoughts and observations.
Yeah, Leon, it's difficult to top what Timo's just said there, because where I've seen businesses struggling and failing in this crisis, a lot of them have been those that have sat back and gone, I just hope this bad stuff will go away eventually and everything will come back to normal, and the government are giving us some bailouts and they're furloughing our staff and we'll just try and ride through it. They're not preparing for that recovery, what it's going to look like, how they can change and adapt and evolve to deal with it. So they're being utterly reactive, and some of them have had to shut up shop already. The ones that are doing well when I say well, I mean that they are on the front foot and they are tracking a path out of this thing. They know what that road to recovery looks like. They're working on their strategy, you know, the strategic planning that Timo was talking about, and they're investing time and effort in that. They haven't wasted the last 4 or 5 months. They've worked on trying to develop leadership. They've worked on trying to develop different patterns and ways of work, different process, and they've done some rigorous planning into the future. And this is where things like, you know, blue teaming, which is working up new plans collaboratively, red teaming, which is challenging existing plans, and wargaming, i.e. stress testing various plans, and the rest of it comes in, because you can, you know, that will very significantly help you on that journey and help you to find some of those answers and to challenge some of your own assumptions and perceptions. And behind all of that, of course, comes leadership. So, you know, I would say invest in the leadership, invest in the planning and the contingency planning. And as Timo said, you know, you get that strategic planning right, look for those opportunities. But there's got to be that will there, and there's got to be that drive.
Yeah. Thank you, Ivor. So Cecilia, some final comments, observations from you.
I think there's been some really good observations and experience from the whole panel. I think it is important, when we spoke to Gareth also earlier, saying that, you know, what he sees a lot is people don't have a big savings culture. So I think there's also, if ever there was a time to really take it seriously, to not run on the edge constantly and live in overdrafts, I think, and this is not stuff no one's heard before, but very few people seem to be doing. You need to be prepared for these things too, and clearly people have been caught out not doing that. Saying that, of course, it's, you know, the market, you do need cash flow, and you will have challenges when that happens. But I think also, you know, I think leadership, or good leadership, it's also been a lesson in that looks different to what we might have thought it looked like. I think there's been, in many big corporations and in many places where I've worked, it's been if you do the time, you will get promoted. Or if you are technically very able and very capable, you will get promoted. That's not necessarily the best leader to manage a team, to run a team, and to deal with unprecedented times. So I think it's also re-looking at what are the leaders of the future going to look like. Yes, technical expertise is always going to be a factor, but maybe the ability to adapt very quickly and move into areas where you're not comfortable is going to become more important. And how do you train for that? So I think those are all really good things that we can start to build into models and consider in a very different way.
Thanks, Cecilia. And Emma, perhaps we can see the results from that last poll. That 28% of us have worked with narcissists, but pretty much all of the above is 40%. And quite a few of us, lack of empathy, quick to anger, managed through intimidation. A bit of fun there, but also very serious, because Gareth's point around psychopaths being in CEO roles or sociopaths, there is a lot of empirical research on that. By means of conclusion, I think we're just even starting and scratching the surface on this topic. And there are so many core themes that I would love to explore. I think just to summarize, there's really two areas. One is around leadership. And if we break that leadership piece down, there's the art of leadership and there is the science. The art as a leader is seeing the best in everybody, talking to them their highest selves, and making them perform to the best of their abilities and believe in themselves. And when it's cold, wet, tough, scary, you're feeling all those things yourself, but actually you tell your team to get comfortable being uncomfortable, and you make them feel comfortable. Are our leaders doing that for us? Are we trying to do that as leaders? We've got to look ourselves in the mirror every day, psych ourselves up. And as Colin Powell says, one of my favorite leaders, optimism is a force multiplier. There's a lot of management in leadership as well. And that can be really trained. And that's the rhythms and rituals that ensure we can scale and succeed. And a lot of those rhythms and rituals can be taught by Gareth, by Berwicks, in terms of, do you have a leadership development program? Do you have a crisis management program in place? It's too late when the crisis has hit. Prepare before. So embracing the art of leadership, which is the fun, inspirational, Shakespearean St. Crispin's Day, Henry V speech. But then you've got the management science of it, which anybody can learn. And then Timo's touched on this. The world has changed. And the one thing we know, the world is going to continue changing. So we need to embrace innovation. Gareth referred to the bottle. Make it a rolling pin. Make it a weapon. But whatever you've got, you need to adapt what you have to the world around you. And if we don't adapt, we are going to fail. So to quote Timo, I'm going to be that tiger. I encourage all our members to be that tiger. Let's get out there. Let's take these lessons. Yes, it is tough, but let's inspire ourselves, inspire each other, and then bring in these kind of management processes that we can learn from other chamber members, from Berwicks and Gareth, to ensure we sustain ourselves. I want to thank, firstly, Jamie, Berwicks, Ivor, thanks so much. Second event we've done together. First one was in the House of Lords early this year. It was great to see you there as our keynotes. Great to catch up after 23 years. Timo, really good to have you in from Zurich. Loved your commercial insights. Gareth, we've been talking for about a year now, and it's great to do our first kind of event together. I've really enjoyed some of our offline conversations, so maybe we can bring some of those online in a month or so. To all our members, we are going to film this. It's been filmed. We're going to put it on our social channels. We can share it. If you want to get in touch with Gareth or the Berwicks team, please reach out to us, and we'll put you in touch with them. Thank you to Cecilia for hosting with me, as always. Much appreciated. Ema and Mission Control, thank you very much for running the polls, including the narcissistic psychopath one. And to Leslie and Venice, just making us all be in the right place at the right time with all the correct information. Thank you very much. Again, I'm not going to say be safe, be careful. I'm going to say get out there and be a tiger, and let's make sure our businesses continue to thrive. Thank you very much for your time this morning. We'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.